My name is Roberto Montano. I'm going to present drift correction techniques for scale adaptive VR navigation, and my co-authors in this project are Patricia Cornelio, Sriram Subramanian, and Diego Martinez. Before actually talk about what is this drift correction about, I would like to explain a bit more about scale adaptive techniques and how these techniques can generate the drift. Virtual reality allows for compelling experiences. Virtual reality navigation, when using physical locomotion, it's usually constrained to small spaces for navigation. For instance, the green grid that is visible in the video is representing the boundaries of the real space available for navigation in the real world. Scale adaptive techniques are expanding these boundaries, allowing users to navigate larger areas by dynamically scaling the user displacement along the navigation. However, this dynamic use of translational gains may induce an additional effect, which is a mismatch between the real and virtual worlds. And this is also called the drift effect. This is an example of the drift effect and how it is affecting a virtual reality navigation. I think that you have seen similar examples in YouTube about the constraints of these kind of things, but it's clear from this example that we have a problem here. So this kind of scale adaptive techniques may induce these kind of things. And at this point, we wanted to know how bad this drift can become. And in order to try to understand a bit more about this, we carried out a user study with 12 participants to gather information about this effect in a navigation task. We asked participants, first, we use 6 flags around spread in the environment, and we asked participants to follow semi-randomized sequences. We used 2 path lengths, the first sequence following 6 flags, and the second path length following 12 flag sequence. We use a scale adaptive technique in the experiment, and we use and scaled a factor of 8 in the environment. The result of the accumulated drift during the experiment is shown here. You can observe that a quick increment from the flag 1 to the flag 6 of the drift, and a kind of stabilization effect from the flag 7 is still growing up, but in a much slower progression. It's worth to mention that during the user study, 4 participants couldn't finish the experiment because they were actually drifted out of the tracking space, and this causes that some of the flags or the targets in the sequence were not reachable anymore. So this is because of the drift effect, and this is highlighting the detrimental effect of the drift when using these kind of techniques for navigation. Going back to the contributions of the paper, we propose a model to characterize scale adaptive techniques, drift effect, and translational gain. We model 2 different correction techniques, and we also contribute with a user study that shows the ability of our approach to correct drift effect with 2 different scale adaptive navigation techniques. Navi fields that represent an example of exocentric control, and 7-leak boots that represents an example of an egocentric control. This is the model that we propose in the paper. It's a generic model for drift correction technique that is basically considering the position of the user in the virtual environment, the user displacement in the real world, the scaling policy of the technique, and of course, is considering the correction function that is going to be based in the approach that we are proposing here. The first one is the derivative correction, driven by the variation of the drifts at each point in time during the navigation. And the second approach is angular correction, based on the implicit relationship between the drift, the translational gain, and the user displacement in the real world. I'm not going to go into details about the models, but I need to highlight the importance of two variables in these models. Epsilon, that represents the bounds of the correction, so how much we are going to allow the correction to influence the scaling policy in the technique, and alpha, that represents the aggressiveness in the correction. How quick do we want the system to respond to changes in drift? Okay, the models were defined, but we still need to find the proper or the best values, the best configuration for these variables. And to do this, we reuse the information we collected in the first experiment about the navigation of the 12 participants along the 12 flags, and we implement a data-driven approach simulations for this search. And we test 49 possible combinations of alpha and epsilon. And we, with the simulation, we were trying to know or to investigate the effect of these values over the correction techniques. We can observe that the red color represents the uncorrected techniques, the purple represents the derivative approach, and the blue one represents the angular one. After these simulations, we got that the best behavior from our corrections is when the alpha and epsilon were 0.25. In order to better analyze this data, we generate a bivariate mapping, considering the standard deviation of the drift and the average drift. The brighter color represents the better behavior when correcting the techniques along the navigation. We can observe that the results from the derivative approach were not that good. However, the results from the angular correction are quite promising. And we can observe in the graph in the bottom that the corrected version of using angular is actually reducing the average drift from almost 70 centimeters to 20. Once we have this data, we need to basically test if the results from these simulations will actually match with real participants in a simulation, in a navigation task. And we carried out a second user study to test the behavior of the angular correction technique. But we also wanted to know if our correction can be generalized. And we test our correction technique with the angular correction with two scale adaptive techniques. Navi fields, as a representative of an eccentric control, where the scaling depends exclusively on the location of the user in the virtual environment or the relevance of each location in the environment. And 7-league boots, that represents an egocentric control, where the scaling depends exclusively on the user's speed. On the right, you can see the environment we use is pretty similar to the one we used in the first study. However, we add an additional area in the center of the environment, and we adjust some parameters in order to have a fair comparison between these two techniques. Also, instead of testing path lengths of 6 flags and 12, in this case, we extend this length in order to really challenge the user and see how much this drift can grow over time. In this case, we are using 42 flags, 42 sequences of flags. Path length of 42, sorry. But in order to know or to guide our exploration in this user study, we wanted to answer some questions. Of course, one of the important ones is if our correction is working. And to do that, we are measuring the drift at the end of each 7-flag pattern. If you remember from the initial, the first user study, there was an increment in drift along the first 6 flags. So we wanted to measure this drift when this theoretical increment in drift is maximum. The second question is if our correction technique is actually extending the navigation. One of the problems we had in the first user study is that some of the participants were drifted out of the tracking space. They couldn't actually finish the sequence of the targets in the navigation. So in this case, we wanted to know, we are considering the number of flags that actually the participants can reach when navigating with the corrected version of the technique and versus the uncorrected one. And finally, we wanted to know if this correction technique is actually negatively affecting the scaling adaptive technique performance or behavior. To do that, we are measuring distance per flag, time per flag, and user perceptions in order to compare. This user perception is measured using a questionnaire focused on comfort, naturalness, consistency, and we are going to discuss a bit more about that later. This is an example of the correction technique in our user study. In this case, this is focused on navi fields, the uncorrected version on top, the corrected version on the bottom. Similarly, the correction technique using 7-league boots. The results of this user study highlight the fact that our correction method is actually reducing the drift factor comparing versus the uncorrected technique. As we can see in the graph, we have some data missing there. That's because participants couldn't actually reach these flags, for example, the flags 28, 35, and 42. And when compared the mean correction in terms of drift, we found significant difference between the drift that was accumulated when using our corrected version of the technique and when they were using the uncorrected version. Our correction method allows extended navigation. As you can see in the graph, we found a significant difference in the number of the flags that the participants could reach when using the corrected version of the techniques. But this correction was not affecting the influence, was not negatively influenced the performance of the original technique, as we couldn't find significant difference between, in terms of distance per flag and time per flag. Our correction method did not negatively influence the experience when comparing the original technique against the corrected counterpart. And that's a curious thing because in the navi field example on the top, we found no significant difference, and we were expecting that. But something happened when using 7-league boots. Maybe we think that there was a kind of self-achievement effect. So as the users were reaching higher number of flags or extending the navigation time, they could attribute some of these to some of the factors in the questionnaires. Summary, we explore and demonstrate the detrimental effect of drift that the drift produces on the scale VR navigation techniques. We propose a model to characterize scale adaptive techniques. We model two different correction techniques, derivative and angular. And we tuned our correction techniques using simulations and found that angular correction performed better than derivative correction. Through a user study, we showed that the angular correction was able to significantly reduce the drift effect in two different scale adaptive techniques, navi fields as an example of an exocentric control, and 7-league boots as an example of an egocentric control. And finally, our correction technique allows extended navigation without affecting the performance of the original technique, while not hindering users' experience. That's all from my talk. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. We have time for questions. Any questions from the audience? And thanks for bearing with and great job talking well during the construction. So, all right. Well, while you're all thinking about your questions, so I really think your results are quite impressive. I'm wondering, and overall a really exciting paper. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your optimization and sort of the terms that you're trying to minimize. And so obviously drift is a big one that's easy to model. And then there's other things like how people are going to feel about it, and are they going to notice this redirection or movement, or is it going to make them more nauseous or other things? How do you think we start to build that into the optimization?
Yeah. First of all, during the optimization process, we need to consider some factors. In this case, one thing I didn't mention here is that in order to measure the drift is a special kind of translational gain that can only be measured in closed paths. So in order to actually measure or estimate the drift, we had to first simulate the path, the way back from each point in the navigation to the center. Then we can estimate the drift. And based on that, sorry, can you repeat the question again?
Sure. Just in terms of thinking about, what are the terms that you're currently minimizing for, and then what are things that are outside of our ability to sort of have a way to model them and find a cost function for them right now? Like,
in this case, the only factor that we were minimizing was focus on the drift.
And do you think about, what are some of the other factors that you might want to optimize for if you could?
In this case, we can also consider time, the distance of the trajectory, so we can actually, if we can reduce the trajectory, we can also kind of reduce the speed or the effect of the motion sickness.
Great. Any questions from the audience? All right. Well, I guess I'm wondering, in terms of other techniques that you think this could be applied to, you sort of showed the 7 leads boots and some of these other scale adaptive techniques. Do you think, we could put this into some of the other types of locomotion techniques?
Yeah, actually, not only locomotion techniques, we can actually have a good complement, for instance, with some teleporting approaches. So the thing is that this technique can be a good complement, for instance, the redirected teleporting, because at the end we are trying to reduce the drift, and the drift is a misalignment between the center of the real and virtual worlds. If we can combine this approach, which is reducing the drift, and combine it with the teleporting, redirected teleporting, we can actually disappear the drift in periods of time.
Great. All right. Well, let's thank the speaker.